Hi, you are starting to listen to the second set of lecture slides here looking at marriage and intimate relationships. So in the previous set of slides, we did some background work talking about some important moments kind of in history related to marriage. We spent some time talking about defining marital success, and we looked at a few predictors of marital success. In this set of slides, we're really focused more on some of the kind of interaction factors correlated with marital success. We are going to be looking at some real relationship maintenance behaviors, things that we can do to improve the relationship, as well as what your book calls threat mitigation behaviors, things to kind of reduce threat or reduce the negative. So there are kind of two sides to the coin, building up the positive versus trying to reduce the negative. Right? There's some overlap there, but there are also distinct differences. As we do that, we're really looking at this core triad of balance that looks at communication behaviors, perceptions, and then physiological reactions. And so that's what the focus of this particular set of lecture slides is. Now, I've been doing a lot of talking, and your book does a lot to describe your marital success, right? But I think it is important to maybe take a brief moment to step back, though, and ask, well, just how good are we at predicting marital success? If we're going to be talking about correlations between factors related to successful versus not successful relationships, how strong are those correlations, or how accurate are those correlations? Well, John Gottman, who that name hopefully looks pretty familiar at this point, as it's cited quite a bit in your chapter, is really known as kind of a guru for romantic relationships. If you find this chapter really interesting, then I strongly encourage you to check out his specific webpage. He has a kind of research institute that has all kinds of resources. He summarizes some of his research work. He and his staff produces a variety of kind of short blogs and kind of short, really good reads about relationship types of topics. You can see on the slide here, I have an app that that you can find that he and his institute have created, so, as a way to kind of I don't know, work on your relationship with your romantic partner in an easy kind of app form. So anyway, check that out if you're really interested. But John Gottman has really been the kind of named the guru of romantic relationships. And over the course of his 30, 40-year career, he's been able to predict with a 92% rate of accuracy whether or not couples will stay together or divorce. And what that means, right? That doesn't mean that he predicts 92% of couples will stay together or will not stay together. What it means is 9 times out of 10, when he makes a prediction about a couple, that they will stay together, that they won't, more than 9 times out of 10 times, he is correct. Right? His prediction is accurate. That's pretty powerful stuff. When we're dealing with human behavior, we don't tend to get those kind of accuracy rates, right? So it's pretty impressive how good he is at predicting the success of romantic relationships. So at this point now, though, you might be asking, well, how does he do that, right? So let me take you to one video that you could find on the Gottman Institute webpage that describes the love lab that he uses. It's just one way that he collects some data in order to make these types of predictions about the relationships. So let's take a minute and check this out. The technicians connect the monitors carefully so that the signals are clear for data analysis. Our computers track facial region, while the video tone records facial expressions. When someone's heart rate rises above 85 beats per minute, that is a sign of flooding or pulmonary receptor. Frequencies between 80 to 100 to computers evaluate the tapes clear. Specially designed monitors have specific codes related to emotions. Expressions of foundation and joy, along with what Dr. Gauman terms the forms of the apocalypse, that includes criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling, are all measured and later analyzed to predict the relationship stability. After these tapes are archived, thousands of tapes record decades of studies on couples. Each tape tells a remarkable story. Once Dr. Gauman analyzes the data on the couple, he meets with them in his office to talk over the findings. Dr. Gauman remains an optimist about making marriages work. He has been able to challenge some conventional theories about marriage by listening carefully to couples rather than overanalyzing intuition. For 20 years, Dr. Gauman has been publishing longitudinal studies systematically. He's written about this research in 124 books and 37 books. Some of you find mathematics very interesting, as Dr. Gauman is. More really interested in his New York Times bestseller, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, or his most recent book, The Relationship Key. His work with his wife, Dr. Julie Schwartz-Gottman, has led to the development of a couples therapy and weekend workshop for couples, all based on scientific principles. How do couples respond after going through Dr. Gauman's Triad? Every couple in marriage will be everything for us, and they can each work just like they can manage and working. Sometimes it's simple, exciting, but sometimes it's very Okay, so at this point you have a little bit better idea of how Gottman goes about making predictions about marital success. And so we're just going to dig into that a little bit deeper in the next couple of sets of slides, right? So your book identifies a couple of different I guess, typologies, a couple of different examples of relationship maintenance strategies that are correlated with marital success. Should have had my book open earlier here, but let me turn to page 130 and page 131. You can see that there are two different kind of models that explain relationship maintenance behaviors associated with marital success. We're really going to focus in on Gottman's list. You can see that there's a lot of similarity between the two lists, but I do want you to be familiar to kind of check out both Gottman's list and Stafford's list, even though we're just really focusing on the one. Okay, so Gottman suggests that there are really 7 behaviors or principles that people in happy, satisfying relationships do, that people in unhappy or unsatisfied relationships don't do. Right? And so you can see the list here on the slide, and again, you can also see the list on page 131. We're just going to walk through a couple of these different particular behaviors. So let's take a first look at the first one. It's called enhancing your love map. Admittedly, I think it's kind of a cheesy name, but it's defined as the attempt to create and maintain a deep knowledge of your partner, which I think obviously is pretty important, right? Let me pull up the rest of the material here. So when people are engaging in this behavior of enhancing the love map, they are really just simply trying to understand and know their partner, right? It looks like trying to create kind of a climate of appreciation, right? Which we know when we feel appreciated, we tend to reciprocate, right? And that is related to long-lasting relationships, right? There's some data that indicates even simply, witnessing an act of compassion can actually make us feel better, and right, can generate positive emotions. So when couples enhance their love map, they really are simply just trying to get to know and really trying to understand their partner. Essentially, they're trying to really talk with their partner. And you can see from the chart here, we know that that does not happen every day, and maybe it doesn't have to happen every day, but it is important that it does happen at some point, right? And reminding ourselves what we love about our romantic partner. When we are in class, I usually take just a few minutes and I ask everybody to pair up, and I ask you guys to work on just a quick activity that involves getting to know the other person better. And it involves answering just some random if questions, right? And so the two of my favorites are, if you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would it be? And if you had any job, what would your ideal job be? So those are kind of silly questions, but what it's asking people to do is to sit down and to talk to another person to try to learn a little bit more about them, right? So it's just kind of one silly example of really kind of enhancing one's love map, right? Couples that sit down and they try to learn more about their partner, and they're consistently trying to really understand their partner, are engaging in this enhanced love map behavior, and they do tend to report being more satisfied than couples that don't do that. Right? In his book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, Gottman has what I think is kind of a nice quote. It says, if you're in the habit of being up to date, you just don't get thrown off as much when the course gets stressful. I think that's really interesting and important. It makes a lot of sense to me. It certainly relates to the power of enhancing the love map. Okay, let me give you another example of one of the relationship maintenance behaviors Gottman says is this core principle that happy couples do that less happy couples don't do, and that is turning towards your partner. So turning towards your partner is defined as making and reciprocating bids for affection, attention, humor, and support, right? So happy couples tend to pay attention to each other, and they tend to turn towards each other for help rather than turning away or turning outside of the marriage to someone else, whether it's a different friend or family member or neighbor, right? Let me follow this up here. Okay, so you can see there just some interesting studies that have kind of supported this claim. Data indicates that those who divorce turn towards each other just a third of the time, while those who remain together report turning towards each other 87% of the time, right? That's a pretty interesting finding, right? In addition to that, we can see a study done by Shelley Gable that suggests one of the really only big differences between couples who break up and those who don't involves the responses that they give each other to good news, right? What her study finds specifically is that when you share good news with your partner, when you're excited about something, you share that with your partner, when they respond in a way that you feel is appropriate and is understanding, right, and is reciprocating your excitement, then that couples that do that tend to stay together. On the other hand, couples that share good news, or an individual that shares good news with your partner, and the partner does not respond in a way that you hope for, does not acknowledge the good news, is not excited for you, those couples are much more likely to break up. Right? So it really speaks to how powerful it is to turn towards each other and to kind of reciprocate those bids for affection and understanding. Right? Another thing I think is really interesting and that's related to turning towards your partner, it's kind of connecting some dots from our previous chapter about storytelling. In a study that Gottman did years ago, he asked couples to report on times when their partner turned towards them or did something kind. And what he found was that unhappy couples missed nearly 50% of the positive things that their partners did for them. right? So in some cases, it might be simply that happy couples are turning towards each other more, unhappy couples are turning towards each other less, but it's also a matter of perception, right? If I'm in an unhappy relationship, it might be that I just simply am ignoring or not looking for those times when my partner is turning towards me or doing something positive. All right. This is just kind of silly, but I think it's a funny meme that's kind of relevant. Okay. The positive perspective is another important one of Gottman's relationship maintenance strategies, right? He suggests that when couples maintain a positive perspective, they just simply let go of things more easily, right? This is where I want to introduce the concept of the magic ratio. This is super powerful, but really easy, simple concept. The magic ratio indicates that happy couples tend to report 5 positive interactions to every 1 negative interaction. So it's not necessarily so much about the number of conflicts that are occurring, but it's the ratio of positive to negative experiences, right? If you are having 5 times more positive interactions to every 1 negative interaction, then you can kind of let that negative interaction kind of roll off your back, right? It reminds me of like an athlete on the field and their coach trying to kind of work with them, right? I don't know if you can relate to this or not, but maybe if you were, if you played sports growing up, you can think of a time where perhaps your coach just really chewed you out or really yelled at you, right? Versus probably several other times where your coach encouraged you or, really gave you positive feedback. My hunch is that you really remember that one negative time, even if it only happened once or only happened a few times, and the positive feedback happened a whole bunch more often, right? There's something about that negative interaction that all the attaboys in the world can't necessarily erase, right? So that same concept works in a romantic relationship, right? Another way to think about it that Gottman sometimes uses is kind of like a relational bank account model. And you'll be, if you've already started reading the 5 love languages, you'll be hearing this model in that as well. The idea behind the relationship bank account model is that positive interactions are like deposits, right? When something positive happens, your partner compliments you, they, do one of your chores for you, right? They get you a gift, whatever that may be. When a positive interaction happens, it's like a deposit into your relationship bank account. And so when you just keep putting positives in there, when at some point, ultimately, you have a withdrawal, you have a negative interaction, the withdrawal is not that big a deal, right? Because you have plenty of savings accrued and you're good to go. However, if you have not been putting deposits into your relationship bank account, if there haven't been a number of positive experiences and all of a sudden a negative thing happens, and so you have this withdrawal, now your relationship is in the red, right? You've overdrawn your relationship bank account and it's a real problem. And so the relationship bank account, or this idea of a magic ratio, is pretty powerful stuff, and it's just one way to really think about this idea of the positive perspective. And I didn't have this pulled up earlier, but now would be certainly a good time to kind of think about how this might relate or how you could connect some dots from this particular material to some of the material we talked about earlier when we talked about effectively managing conflict. Okay, so at this point, we've talked about a lot of the relationship maintenance strategies. We certainly haven't covered all 7 of Gottman's relationship suggestions. And as I mentioned, I didn't discuss too much of Stafford's typology, but we get the idea here that there are certainly a set of relationship maintenance behaviors, communication strategies that are correlated with marital success. On the other hand, however, there are some kind of threat mitigation things that couples can do to kind of reduce the negative. Right? Oh, on the other hand, there are some negative behaviors that when couples do them are very, very hard on a relationship. Right? Gottman specifically calls these behaviors the 4 horsemen. Right? You can kind of think about that reference. But so the 4 horsemen, when it comes to communication, are called criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And Gottman argues when these particular behaviors start to intrude into romantic relationships, it can really start to signal the end of the romantic relationship. If couples do these things and then continue to do them, it's really hard for a relationship to continue. So you can see by the infographic there some examples of each, right? Criticism involves verbally attacking a person, right? It can be really specific attacks on the individual's personality or particular behaviors that they are engaging in. Contempt, on the other hand, is more of kind of an overall feeling of disdain, or a more general feeling of disgust, right? Defensiveness occurs when an individual feels like they are kind of the victim, and they, rather than listen to that and feel attacked, they kind of reverse the blame or engage in counter blame for the person who they feel like they're being attacked by. And then stonewalling. Stonewalling is when someone withdraws, right, or literally, well, not literally, figuratively puts up a stone wall, a separation or distance between them and the person that they are interacting with. You can certainly, I think, see how interrelated these particular behaviors could be, right? If you continually felt criticized, then you might become very defensive. And if you got to be defensive and were kind of counter blaming your partner for things, then they might really start to feel contempt for you. And if they have this overall general feeling of disdain for you, then you might say, well, fine, I'll just put up my stone wall, right, and use stonewalling behaviors. So these behaviors are very interrelated, and that's exactly why Gottman suggests once they start to kind of enter into a relationship, then they really can kind of be a signal for the end of the relationship, unless the partners are able to change things or kind of regroup and go a different direction. Okay, so at this point, we've really talked about key communication behaviors, both relationship behaviors and things that can mitigate threats. I mentioned the core triad of balance is about communication, but it's also about perception. So now let's take a few minutes to look at perception and marital success. So of course, perception is not so much the actual behaviors that are occurring between a couple, but instead how we think about those behaviors, right? And how we interpret those behaviors. And so one way to look at perception is to use attribution theory. So it's a really helpful theory. We're just going to briefly talk about it, but basically the theory says that human beings are constantly trying to explain others' behaviors. And one way to think about that is I like to call us naive scientists. Right? So human beings are quote unquote scientists because we are continually trying to answer questions, right, or to understand. That's what scientists do. On the other hand, though, we are naive, right? And think about what naive means, right? We're kind of gullible, we're kind of underinformed, maybe even a little ignorant, right? So as human beings, we're trying to answer questions about how people are acting towards us and about our relationships, but we do so in kind of a naive or really unsystematic way, right? I might be trying to figure, well, why didn't he text back yet? Or maybe he texted back and I'm trying to figure out, why did he use an exclamation point? Right? Why did she ignore me in the hallway? Why did he give her the promotion and not me? When we just constantly are trying to ask those questions and answer those questions, but we typically do it in a less than systematic, usually kind of less than objective way, right? So attribution theory tries to explain how we come up with or how we engage in this process of trying to explain others' behaviors, right? And as your book points out, attribution theory says our attributions can be categorized in a couple different ways. Probably the most significant and certainly the easiest to understand is internal versus external attributions. Right? When we make internal attributions, we assume the cause of an event has to do with some kind of internal underlying condition, right? Something specific to that person. On the other hand, when we make external attributions, we assume the cause of an event is due to something external or some kind of set of circumstances or situations, right? So, for example, let's say my romantic partner, my husband comes home with flowers, right? If I make an internal attribution, I'm probably saying, well, the reason he came home with flowers is because he's a really nice guy, or because he, was feeling sentimental. or something like that, right? On the other hand, if I make external attribution, then I might say something like, well, the flowers were on sale, right? Or I don't know, maybe even something like his boss happened to have a garden full of flowers that were available, right? It was something not unique to him. Okay. Now, when we are making these attributions, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to not do it in a very systematic way. We don't tend to be very objective, or frankly, we tend to be pretty biased. Right? We're biased when we make these attributions, and the attributions are kind of self-serving, right? They kind of promote our own agenda. One thing that we do, one label that has been created to help us talk about this is the concept of the fundamental attribution error. We tend to make a fundamental attribution error. What that means is we tend to give our own selves the benefit of the doubt, right? And so if something really good has happened or positive, I tend to attribute that internally. On the other hand, if a mistake occurs, something bad happens, I tend to attribute that externally, right? So let me just give you an example of driving down the street. It's not a romantic example, but I think it's one we can all relate to, right? If you were driving down the street and trying to get to campus, right, and you're trucking along and a car in front of you is slowing you down and they aren't going as fast as you want, maybe they're even swerving a little, they're kind of getting in your way. Okay, so if I asked you why that was happening, my hunch is the vast majority of you would say things like, well, that person was on their phone and they were not paying attention. Maybe that person was old. Right? We kind of have a age bias for drivers. Maybe that person was under the influence, right? Or maybe that person was just simply daydreaming and not paying attention. Okay, so you may have noticed all of those attributions were internal. They were all something specific to that person, right? That person was messing up because of something they specifically were doing or some reason internal to them. Now, if I flipped it around a little and I said, you were driving to campus and you just all of the blue swerved, and then you were driving kind of erratically, and I asked you, why'd you do that? What would be some explanations? My hunch is we'd come up with really different answers. Right, you might say, well, a squirrel jumped out in front of me and I didn't want to crash into the squirrel. You might say, well, the road was really icy and then I hit a patch of ice, or there was a giant pothole, and so I was trying to go around the pothole. All of those answers, hopefully those sound different to you. They are all external attributions. They are saying, well, the reason I drove poorly was because of the situation, not something specific to me. So you can see, hopefully, that the examples I just gave were an example of the fundamental attribution error. When we thought someone else was doing something wrong, we said it was their fault. Something specific to them caused them to be doing that thing wrong. When we were doing something wrong, when I was driving poorly, I attributed it to an external cause. Right? It couldn't have been my fault. It was a situation that caused the problem. Okay, that's what we mean by the fundamental attribution error. The flip side can be true, though, right? What I mean by that is when something good happens, right? If I do really well on an exam, and the odds are I'm going to attribute that internally. Well, I studied hard. I read a whole bunch. I prepared well. If my roommate does really well on an exam, I might be much more likely to say, well, the exam must have been easy, or the professor just really likes her. Okay, so either way, you can see from all those examples, the fundamental attribution error says we kind of give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. Your book identifies just a couple of other important concepts related to perception and marital success. Let's see, one of those terms refers to cognitive editing, and that's one concept that I want you to make sure you're familiar with. If you kind of break that down, right? Cognitive has to do with thinking, right? And editing has to do with kind of adjusting or revising, right? So cognitive editing involves this kind of process of kind of going back and rethinking something that's happened, right? So you might think within your own relationships what that would look like, right? You might go back and you might, if you're in what you feel like is a really positive relationship right now, you might go back and you might edit out some kind of negative details or problematic things. Or you might embellish some of the really good components, positive things. Okay, so cognitive editing is certainly an important piece of this perception the perception and its influence on marital success. Right? And closely related to that, your book talks about this concept of sentiment override. Sentiment override, again, you kind of break it down. Sentiment involves kind of how you feel towards something. Override involves kind of taking over, right? So sentiment override involves our emotions kind of taking over and interpreting how we, or influencing how we interpret an event. If I have generally positive feelings towards someone, then sentiment override might lead me to overlook some of their negative characteristics or negative behaviors. Whereas if I have a negative sentiment towards someone, I might not be able to overlook those things. They might, in fact, instead dwell on these kind of negative characteristics, right? So, in general, Gottman would argue that we're better off if we can have kind of a positive sentiment override, if we can give people the benefit of the doubt, if we can engage in kind of this kind act of not dwelling on the negative, right? And in fact, Gottman would argue that that's where most problems come from, right? Focusing on the negative rather than just kind of giving our partner the benefit of the doubt. Unfortunately, I think that's really easy to do. It's kind of ironic, right? I think we sometimes sometimes we're just a lot harder on people that are close to us and our romantic partners than we are to, acquaintances or even strangers, right? We don't give our partners the benefit of the doubt. I wish we were in class right now to maybe discuss that a little bit more and think about why we do that. But Gottman says, when we are able to engage in positive sentiment override, when we engage in cognitive editing, that just simply does cut our partner some slack. We tend to be better off. Now, I'm kind of running over time here and I want to wrap this slide up, so I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I encourage you to check out page 145, 146. It does spend a little bit of time, though, pointing out that there might be some instances where it might be problematic to be too kind or to give someone too much benefit of the doubt, right? In situations where there might be some type of spousal abuse or domestic violence. So that's important, and I encourage you to check that out, but I won't necessarily focus on that right now. Okay. All right, so at this point, we've looked at communication strategies. We've talked some about perception. The final piece of the core triad of balance is physiology, right? And so when we're looking at physiology, we're talking about how your body reacts to distressing situations in this case, right? And so Gottman argues that happy couples or satisfied couples, sometimes he calls them the masters, they tend to simply just be a lot more aware of their own physiology. They tend to notice when they're starting to get upset and then are able to manage that better. On the other hand, unsatisfied couples, or what he sometimes calls disasters, are just less aware of that, right? And they often tend to kind of go into this fight or flight response, right? Avoid or fight when a negative thing occurs, right? When you can imagine why that would be problematic. Okay. We previously, I think, talked about this concept of flooding. Or if we haven't talked about it yet, we'll talk about it more. Flooding is when your body you just get totally overwhelmed, right? When you just kind of feel like, you just lose it, basically. And so what tends to happen for unhappy couples is they either don't notice that they're getting flooded, or even when they are flooded, they continue an interaction. Versus happy couples tend to be more aware of when that's happening and are able to take a step back and say, listen, I'm flooded right now, or I feel overwhelmed right now. I need a few minutes to calm down before we continue with this interaction. Okay. Okay, so at this point, I think we'll stop. The slide got a little bit long here, so we'll stop here, and we'll have one more set of slides that just looks at various different types of marriages.